All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our RBT practice question series where we're going through another set of questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out btexamreview.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. A medical clinic wants to improve its efficiency. The office manager decides to measure how long it takes from when a patient checks in until they are called back to an exam room. The manager records this time for each patient throughout the day. The type of measurement being used is what? So we have a measurement question, and it's a pretty straightforward measurement question. When you get a measurement question, you want to start to identify, most importantly, what we're measuring, and then you want to think about, are we measuring an amount of time, or are we measuring a number of responses? In other words, a count. In this case, the office manager is measuring how long. So immediately when you see how long or time, you want to start thinking time-based measurement, something like duration, latency, or inter-response time. And what they're measuring specifically is when from the time the patient checks in until they are called back to the exam room. So the office manager isn't necessarily measuring a specific behavior, but rather the time in between something. And so when we're measuring time in between, we have two options. We have latency and inter-response time. Latency is the time in between the SD and the first response. This is our latency. Inter-response time is the time in between response 1, response 2, response 2, response 3, so on and so forth. So inter-response time is time in between responses. Latency is the time in between the SD and the first response. So if the SD is the patient checking in and the first response is being called back to the exam room, then what is the office manager measuring? Well, latency. If you visualize it like that, it's pretty straightforward. Now, inter-response time is going to be our time in between responses. We're not measuring time in between being called back to the exam room, right? We're measuring from when the patient checks in until that response occurs, the latency of being called back. C, duration. Duration measures the time of a specific behavior, which the office manager is not measuring. And then the D, rate, involves frequency over time. We're not measuring any sort of frequency, therefore we cannot produce a rate. So what is the office manager measuring? They're measuring the latency, or how long it takes to be called back to an exam room once somebody arrives. After completing his morning routine independently, a student is given a toy and is allowed to spend 5 minutes playing with the toy. As a result, he completes his routine more frequently. What makes this an example of positive reinforcement? So in this consequence question, the question is actually telling us off the bat that this is positive reinforcement. As we know, positive reinforcement means we're adding something that is increasing behavior. In this case, once the routine is completed, the student is given the toy and plays 5 minutes with the toy. So if completing the morning routine is the behavior, the consequence is being given the toy and then playing with the toy. Now, the question wants to know, how is this in particular positive reinforcement? Well, if you look at A, the delivery of the toy leads to an increase in future behavior. That is how we would describe positive reinforcement. We are adding something that is increasing future behavior. The routine is happening more frequently. Remember, consequences like punishment and reinforcement are focused on future behavior, not B, current behavior. B, the delivery of the toy leads to an increase in current behavior. The consequence happens after the behavior. So the only behavior the consequence can impact is future behavior. So again, when we're looking at reinforcement, punishment, or even extinction, we're thinking about future behavior. So we know A is right, B is wrong. Let's read C. The delivery of the toy represents a stimulus added to the environment. Yes, positive indicates we have added a stimulus to the environment. Negative, if it was negative reinforcement, we would have removed something. Once the student engages in the behavior, they are given a toy. We're adding that toy, it's positive. So what makes this an example of positive reinforcement? A, the delivery of the toy leads to an increase in future behavior, as reinforcement does. And C, the delivery of the toy represents a stimulus added positive to the environment. After implementing an intervention to increase a client's independent task completion, a behavior technician notices that the data path shows a highly variable pattern with no clear trend during intervention. When preparing the graph for the next team meeting, the most appropriate action would be to do what? So we have a graphing question, and it's going to be an interpretation question or a intervention question, because it's asking you, if you're putting yourself in the shoes of this technician, what you would do in this situation. Because we have a situation where the intervention was designed to increase independent task completion, but the technician saw that the data path was highly variable and no clear trend. So if we have a highly variable data path with no clear trend, it might look something like this, where the data is all over the place. It's not clear if it's increasing, if it's decreasing. The lowest data point is far away from the highest data point. We're not going to be able to get much out of this data, right? It's not telling us exactly what's happening as a result of our intervention. So if we get a graph like this, what should we do, or what should this technician do when preparing the graph for the next team meeting? A, smooth the data path by removing outlier data. No, all data that is recorded should be included in the graph. Even outlier data can tell us something about the behavior. So we shouldn't manipulate the data just to make it fit what we want to happen. B, calculate the average from the data and display that instead of individual data points. Again, no, we want to see exactly what's happening with the data. And so just taking the average of this highly variable pattern is going to give a misleading number or result for the behavior. C, continue plotting all data points accurately and as measured. Yes, even if the data are not showing what we want to see, or they look variable and they're all over the place, we want to continue plotting those data points accurately. Because what's going to happen is the supervising behavior analyst, or the BCBA in charge, can now take that data and decide what they want to do next. D, only graph the best data points to emphasize successes. That would be the worst thing to do, because now we're manipulating data. We're showing something that doesn't exist. Graphs are there to help us visualize what is happening with the behavior. If we're manipulating that data in any way, we're not giving an accurate representation of what's happening with the behavior. So the most appropriate action is to continue plotting all data points accurately and as measured, no matter how bad that data might be. During a social skills training session, a behavior technician is teaching a client how to greet peers. When a peer approaches the client and stands near them, the technician says, "Remember to say hello." This is an example of what? So it looks like a prompting question, because if we think about it, we have a social skills training session. We're trying to teach the client how to greet peers. So the behavior of interest is greeting peers. When the peer approaches the client and stands near them, which should be the SD to say hello, the technician inserts, "Remember to say hello." So this is our SD, and this is our prompt. So the prompt is, "Remember to say hello." Now, what type of prompt is that? A gestural prompt, or gestural prompting. With gestural prompting, we're making a motor movement, maybe pointing or shifting something to indicate what we want to see out of the client. In this case, the technician is using their voice, right? They are using a verbal prompt. It's a pretty clear verbal prompt. The peer approaches, technician, verbal prompt, "Remember to say hello." Hopefully the client then says hello. C, shaping. With shaping, we're looking for reinforcement of approximations of behavior. We're not necessarily reinforcing approximations here. We're not even discussing reinforcement. We're talking about what's happening prior to that client actually engaging in the behavior, which is they receive this prompt. And then D, visual prompting, is exactly what it sounds like. We use some sort of visual cue to indicate what we want to see. That's not what occurred here. The technician used that verbal prompt to get the client to engage in the correct behavior. A man frequently jokes during staff meetings to gain laughter and attention from coworkers. Over time, his coworkers stop laughing or reacting to the jokes. Eventually, the man stops joking in meetings altogether. This change in behavior is most likely due to what? So another behavior change question, and when we have a behavior change question, we first ask ourselves, how did the behavior change? Did it increase or did it decrease? Because that's going to give us a lot of information. We know the man was joking during staff meetings for laughter and attention. Over time, the laughing or reacting went away. So he was doing a behavior, it was getting reinforcement, and then the reinforcement was being withheld. What happened? Eventually, the man stopped joking in meetings altogether. His behavior decreased. So if that change was a decrease, we know this has to be punishment or extinction. Well, when we were reading the question, we said the reinforcement was now being withheld. So when we withhold reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior, it's going to be A, extinction. B, negative reinforcement is when we take a stimulus away that increases behavior. Well, we haven't taken anything away, we're withholding, and the behavior is going down. It can't be reinforcement. C, negative punishment is similar with taking something away to decrease the behavior. Nothing's being taken away from the man when he jokes now. The only difference is he's no longer getting a reaction. That reaction is being withheld. So if something is being withheld, now we're talking extinction. Punishment, we're actually removing or adding something. So it's not going to be negative punishment. And then D, prompt fading. Well, we're not looking at any prompts in this situation. We're looking at the result of the jokes, which is a withdrawal or withholding of laughter and attention, which means a change in behavior is most likely due to A, extinction. Thanks for watching. Check out btexamreview.com for all of our study materials. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. As always, work hard, study hard. We'll see you soon.